The world remembers the generals, the speeches, the medals, the triumphs. History has carved their names into the marble of time. But beyond the glow of victory there were countless others, men and women whose courage lived in the shadows, whose names dissolved into the dust of forgotten archives. They did not seek fame or glory. They were mechanics, nurses, radio operators, miners, and mothers. Yet, in the darkest days of the Second World War, they carried the weight of nations upon their shoulders. When the sky burned over London, it was not only the pilots who defended the city, but the nameless firemen who battled the flames for nights without rest. When the snows of the Eastern Front swallowed armies whole, it was not only the soldiers who fought, but the rail workers who rebuilt shattered tracks beneath artillery fire, so that supplies could still reach the front. Their hands were rough, their faces unseen, their stories buried under the noise of history. Yet without them, the war would have ended in silence and defeat. For every hero who stood before cameras, there were 1,000 more who never returned home, whose only monument is the peace we take for granted. These forgotten faces of valour remind us that courage is not born from recognition. It is born from necessity, from the quiet decision to act when fear commands stillness. It lives in those who repair instead of destroy, who endure instead of surrender, who give instead of take. Across the continents, from the deserts of North Africa to the ruins of Stalingrad, from the jungles of Burma to the factories of Detroit, there were millions of such souls. They rose not as conquerors, but as keepers of hope. They worked in dim light, under curfew, under bombing raids, with trembling hands and hungry hearts. But they worked. They believed that even a small act, a welded plate, a decoded message, a hidden child, could turn the tide of history. Their faces were never captured in the triumphant photographs of victory. Their names were not read aloud on the day the war ended, but their spirit, that quiet, unyielding spirit, still echoes through the decades. It whispers from the rusted helmets, from the faded letters, from the ruins where freedom was born from fire. This story is not about kings or commanders. It is about them, the silent ones, the unseen, the forgotten. The true architects of endurance, whose courage built the world anew. When the world plunged into darkness in 1939, the front lines stretched far beyond the battlefields. Hidden behind walls of smoke and secrecy were the men and women who built the invisible backbone of war. The engineers, the inventors, the dreamers who turned desperation into design. They did not fire bullets, yet every shot that echoed across Europe carried the signature of their craft. They were the shadow engineers, soldiers of steel and circuitry, whose weapons were blueprints and wrenches instead of rifles and grenades. In Britain, deep beneath the roaring skies of the Blitz, the factories never slept. By day, the sirens wailed. By night, the furnaces glowed red with resolve. Men like Sir Stanley Hooker, a quiet mathematician with ink-stained fingers, redesigned the engines of the Spitfire, the aircraft that would become the beating heart of Britain's survival. His genius was not born in comfort, but in urgency. When others fled to shelters, Hooker stayed with his notes, recalculating airflow and compression ratios by candlelight. The result was not a new engine. It was a miracle of endurance, a machine that gave the outnumbered RAF the wings to fight back. Across the seas, in the frozen wastelands beyond the Ural Mountains, Soviet engineers fought their own war against the impossible. Factories were uprooted from the west, hauled across thousands of kilometers by trains, and rebuilt under snow and starvation. There, in the harsh breath of Siberia, they forged the T-34 tank, a creation so balanced, so brutally efficient, that even the German generals would later call it a masterpiece of death. But behind that steel monster were hands, often the hands of women and teenagers, that hammered, welded, and shaped each armor plate while bombs fell in the distance. One such engineer, Evgenia Rudnova, was barely 20 when she volunteered to design optical sights for Soviet bombers. Her lab was unheated, frost covered the windows and her ink froze between lines. Yet her designs allowed pilots to strike targets with uncanny precision at night. When she later joined the front herself as a navigator, her own invention guided her plane. She died in 1944, her body found beside her shattered aircraft. Still holding her navigation tools, her blueprints recovered from her bag continued to be used until the war's end. In the heart of Germany, far from the battlefield, other minds worked in shadow, some willingly, others in quiet resistance. The Peenemünde engineers created the V2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, a weapon born from brilliance and despair. Yet even among them were those who secretly sabotaged their own work, altering circuits so that rockets failed in flight. One unnamed engineer later confessed after the war, "I could not stop the machine of war, but I could make it stumble." His name remains unknown, one of many ghosts in the machinery of history. Meanwhile, in the United States, innovation was racing against time. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, known as the Arsenal of Democracy, became the largest factory on Earth. Designed by Charles Sorensen of Ford, it produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Imagine, an entire 4-engine aircraft rolling out every hour, built not by soldiers, but by housewives, farmers and mechanics who had never touched a plane before. These people were engineers by necessity, inventors by circumstance. Their precision was the quiet rhythm that kept the world from falling apart. Yet, not all engineering victories were grand or metallic. Some were simple, born from the trenches of desperation. In North Africa, a British field engineer named Tom Walsh discovered that tank engines seized in the desert heat because of sand in the filters. Lacking supplies, he tore apart old uniforms and turned them into makeshift air filters. The fix saved dozens of tanks from destruction and helped his division survive the scorching campaign. No medal was ever awarded, but his crude invention became standard practice across the front. Across the Pacific, in the islands of the Philippines, local engineers and civilians built makeshift airfields using hand tools and bamboo rollers. When American bombers returned months later, they found fully functional runways carved into the jungle, constructed in secret by people who had no maps, no machines, and no promise of survival. These were acts of silent defiance, acts of creation in a world devoted to destruction. Engineering in wartime was not only about metal and engines, it was about imagination under pressure, ingenuity under fear. Each nut and bolt carried a prayer. Each completed machine was a small rebellion against chaos. In Britain's underground factories, workers painted stars on completed Spitfire wings for good luck. In Soviet plants, women welded their initials inside tank hulls, so that, as they said, "A piece of our hearts goes to the front." The shadow engineers lived and died in anonymity, but their creations shaped every corner of the conflict. The radar towers that pierced the clouds over England, the floating harbours that carried D-Day across the Channel, the code machines that hummed beneath the silence, all bore the fingerprints of these invisible minds. History often measures war in victories and defeats, in generals and flags. But the true measure of endurance lies in the hands that built when everything around them was breaking. The engineer who tightens a bolt under fire, the machinist who refuses to sleep until the part fits perfectly, the scientist who trades comfort for creation, they are the architects of resilience. As the war dragged on, their innovations turned the tide again and again. The Mulberry harbours, designed in secrecy, allowed Allied forces to land supplies directly on Normandy's beaches, a feat thought impossible. The proximity fuse, engineered by American physicists, made anti-aircraft shells explode with unprecedented accuracy, saving thousands of lives. None of these names were known to the public, yet they built the path to victory. By 1945, when the world finally fell silent, the weapons were laid down, but the engineers remained. Many of them never saw the front lines they had helped to win. Their reward was not parades or medals, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that their craft had saved lives. They returned to their workshops, to their blueprints, to their ordinary lives. History forgot them, but the world they helped preserve did not. They were the unseen architects of victory, the silent builders who fought with ideas instead of rifles. In the shadows, they forged the machinery of hope, proving that even in the darkest hours of human history, creation can be the greatest act of courage. In the vast and brutal theatre of the Second World War, where thunderous artillery roared and cities turned to dust, there existed another front, silent, sterile, and hidden from glory. It was not fought with rifles or tanks, but with scalpels, bandages, and the fragile pulse of human hope. These were the silent healers, the doctors, nurses, orderlies, and medics whose courage rarely made the history books, but whose hands saved millions. Behind every soldier who returned home alive stood a healer who refused to surrender to despair. At the beginning of the war, military medicine was unprepared for the scale of destruction to come. The First World War had already introduced the horror of trench wounds and gas attacks, yet the Second would surpass it in both carnage and chaos. On every front, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen wastes of Stalingrad, medical personnel worked under impossible conditions. They transformed barns into hospitals, ships into floating clinics, and abandoned churches into sanctuaries of life. They fought not an enemy of flesh and blood, but infection, shock, and time itself. One of the most remarkable figures was Dr. Archibald Mackindoe, a New Zealand-born plastic surgeon working for the Royal Air Force in Britain. As pilots were burned alive in their Spitfires and bombers, Mackindoe began to pioneer new techniques of reconstructive surgery. In his small hospital in East Grinstead, he created what became known as the Guinea Pig Club, a brotherhood of disfigured airmen who underwent experimental operations to rebuild their faces and hands. Yet Mackindoe's true genius was not only in surgery, it was in restoring dignity. He insisted that his patients wear normal clothes, walk the streets, and be treated as heroes, not monsters. The people of East Grinstead, inspired by his compassion, welcomed these men into their lives, helping to heal not just their bodies, but their souls. Across the Atlantic, Dr. Charles Drew, an African-American physician, revolutionized wartime medicine with his groundbreaking work on blood plasma storage and transfusion. Before Drew's research, blood could not be preserved for long or transported safely, but through meticulous experimentation, he discovered how to separate plasma from whole blood, allowing it to be stored and shipped overseas. His innovation made large-scale blood banks possible, saving countless soldiers on the front lines. Tragically, Drew himself would later die in a car accident in 1950, but his work continues to sustain life to this day. Yet despite his achievements, racial prejudice denied him full recognition during his lifetime, a painful reminder that even heroes of mercy were not immune to the wounds of their age. In the Soviet Union, where cities burned and millions perished, female medics and nurses became the unsung backbone of the Red Army. Known as Sisters of Mercy, they carried wounded men off the battlefield under relentless enemy fire. One such woman, Yevdokia Nikolaeva Zavali, began as a medic but ended up commanding a platoon of men, becoming the only female commander of a male combat unit in the Soviet forces. Yet she never forgot her first duty, to save life, even amidst death. Soviet field hospitals often had to perform surgeries without anesthesia, sterilization, or light, using vodka as disinfectant and candlelight as their only illumination. In such conditions, even a single successful operation was a miracle. In the jungles of Burma, the Chindits, a special operations unit led by British and Indian soldiers, owed their survival to medics who carried entire field hospitals on their backs. Disease, especially malaria and dysentery, killed more men than bullets. The medics had to improvise constantly, using bamboo for splints, jungle leaves for dressings, and the cool streams as operating tables. Many of these men never fired a weapon, yet their bravery equaled any commandos. Meanwhile, in occupied Europe, doctors risked their lives in secret hospitals to treat partisans, Jews, and civilians hunted by the Nazis. In the Warsaw Ghetto, Dr. Adina Bloody-Schweiger, barely in her 20s, fought to save children dying from starvation and disease. When the Nazis began liquidating the ghetto, she made an unthinkable choice: to administer morphine to dying infants so they would not be taken to the gas chambers. Her story, told only decades later, stands as a haunting symbol of mercy in the face of absolute evil. On the Pacific Front, Japanese, American, and Filipino medics faced their own nightmares. The tropical heat, maggots, and infections turned every wound into a potential death sentence. Yet amid that horror, there were moments of shared humanity. During the Battle of Okinawa, several reports tell of medics from both sides tending to enemy wounded when fighting paused. For a fleeting moment, the Hippocratic Oath transcended national boundaries. The act of healing became an act of defiance against the madness of war itself. Back home, nurses in Britain, the United States, Canada, and Australia formed the backbone of wartime hospitals. The Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, for example, deployed women to the front lines, where they faced bombings, exhaustion, and trauma. Many of them, such as Sister Vivian Bullwinkle, became prisoners of war after being captured by the Japanese in 1942. Bullwinkle survived the Banker Island massacre, where 21 of her fellow nurses were executed. Though wounded, she later testified at war crime tribunals, ensuring their sacrifice would not be forgotten. There were also healers whose battlefield was not physical, but psychological. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was rampant. Pioneers like Dr. Abram Kardner and Wilfred Bion began to explore the mental wounds of war, challenging the old belief that fear was cowardice. They laid the foundation for modern trauma therapy, though their work would not be fully appreciated until decades later. The silent healers were not soldiers in the traditional sense, yet their contribution was no less vital. They worked without rest, often without recognition, in conditions that defied human endurance. Their tools were not guns, but gauze and grace, their victories not measured in ground gained, but in lives reclaimed from the brink. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, much of the world celebrated its generals and politicians. But somewhere in a forgotten field hospital, a nurse was still changing bandages, a doctor still writing a death certificate, a medic still weeping for the man he could not save. Their war did not end with victory, it ended in silence. And yet that silence was sacred, for within it lay the quiet triumph of compassion, the heartbeat of humanity that refused to die, even in the darkest of times. These men and women, the silent healers of World War II, proved that amidst destruction, the most powerful weapon of all was mercy. In the hidden chambers of Bletchley Park, far from the thunder of artillery and the chaos of front lines, another kind of war was being fought, a war of intellect, logic, and secrecy. These were the Codebreakers, men and women who wielded pens instead of rifles, silence instead of glory. Their battlefield was ink and paper, their enemies were ciphers, and their victories were measured in lives saved, not medals earned. At the heart of this secret war stood Alan Turing, a mathematician whose genius would alter the course of history. With his mind sharper than any blade, Turing led a team that sought to decipher the unbreakable, the German Enigma code, a machine whose endless combinations made messages virtually impossible to read. The Nazis believed their communications were safe, hidden behind the mechanical labyrinth of rotating rotors and electric currents. But in the quiet halls of Bletchley Park, Turing's machine, the bomb, began to crack their illusions of invincibility. Each decrypted message revealed the enemy's plans, ship movements, and troop deployments. Convoys were redirected, ambushes were avoided, and lives were spared. Yet no one could ever know. The Codebreakers signed secrecy oaths that bound their tongues for decades. When the war ended, many returned to ordinary lives, their monumental contributions locked away in classified files. But the story of the Codebreakers extended beyond Britain. In Poland, 3 mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski, had laid the groundwork years before. Using pure mathematical reasoning, they broke early versions of the Enigma, sending their findings to Britain just before their homeland fell. Their brilliance, like so many others during the war, remained shrouded in silence and obscurity. In the Pacific, American cryptanalysts faced their own invisible war. The Navajo code talkers, recruited from indigenous tribes, spoke a language so unique that it became an unbreakable cipher for US military communications. Their voices carried secret orders across battlefields, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. Yet for years their heroism was forgotten, buried beneath prejudice and politics. The codebreakers and cryptographers of World War II didn't merely shorten the war, they redefined intelligence, technology, and secrecy itself. The computers and cybersecurity systems of today trace their lineage back to those dimly lit rooms filled with cigarette smoke, clattering machines, and the endless pursuit of a single truth hidden within a million possibilities. These were the unsung architects of victory, the minds that turned the tide of history, not through violence, but through thought. While the codebreakers fought their silent battle with machines and mathematics, another war unfolded in the shadows, the war of spies, double agents, and deception. It was a realm of half-truths and invisible loyalties, where a single forged letter could save a continent, and one whispered word could destroy an empire. Among these phantoms of history stood Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, a Spanish double agent who deceived the entire Nazi high command. Feigning loyalty to Germany while secretly serving Britain's MI5, Garbo built an imaginary network of spies, feeding Hitler an elaborate web of lies. In 1944, his greatest deception, Operation Fortitude, convinced the Nazis that the Allied invasion would strike at Calais instead of Normandy. Because of Garbo's false reports, Hitler delayed reinforcements, ensuring the success of D-Day. His victory was silent, bloodless, yet monumental. Then there was Noor Inayat Khan, a British Indian Muslim woman who served as a wireless operator in Nazi-occupied France. Operating under constant threat, she transmitted intelligence back to London until her capture. Even under brutal interrogation, Noor revealed nothing. Her silence became her final act of defiance. Executed at Dachau, her last word was liberté. Her courage embodied the spirit of countless operatives who vanished into the smoke of war, their sacrifices erased by secrecy. The Soviet Union, too, waged its own invisible battles. Networks like the Cambridge Five infiltrated British intelligence, feeding the Kremlin with secrets that shaped Cold War politics long before the war even ended. And in the United States, Japanese-American spies, often distrusted by their own government, risked everything to decode Tokyo's war plans, a quiet paradox of loyalty amid discrimination. From Berlin's nightclubs to the alleys of Warsaw, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Burma, spies and informants carried invisible weapons, forged passports, coded letters, and unbreakable nerves. Some worked for glory, others for ideology, and many simply for the hope that their small act of deception might bring peace sooner. Their names were rarely recorded in medals or monuments, yet their influence rippled across continents. Wars are often remembered for their generals and soldiers, but it was the shadow warriors, those who lied for truth and risked everything for nations that might never know their names, who ensured the world survived its darkest night. In the hidden theatres of World War II, truth itself became the most powerful weapon, and those who wielded it, through codes, lies, and silence, were the invisible hands that shaped victory. In the dark heart of occupied Europe, while Nazi banners fluttered over conquered capitals and the air was thick with fear, there were those who refused to bow. They were not soldiers of any formal army, nor were they guided by rank or uniform. They were farmers, students, teachers, miners, priests, ordinary souls who chose defiance over submission. They were the resistance fighters, the invisible warriors who struck from the shadows, breathing life into the fading hope of freedom. In the cobblestone streets of Paris, whispers became weapons. Underground newspapers like Combat and Liberation spread truth where propaganda reigned. Railway workers sabotaged German trains, derailing supply convoys under the cover of night. The French resistance, fragmented at first, grew into a nationwide network under leaders like Jean Moulin, who unified the factions under the Free French banner of Charles de Gaulle. When the Allies landed in Normandy, it was these hidden fighters who crippled German communications, cut rail lines, and guided paratroopers through unfamiliar terrain. Their actions turned chaos into strategy, silent, unseen, yet decisive. In Poland, resistance took on a more tragic yet unmatched scale. The Home Army, Armia Krajowa, became the largest underground force in Europe, counting hundreds of thousands of members. In 1944, as Soviet troops approached Warsaw, they launched the Warsaw Uprising, a desperate bid to reclaim their capital before the Red Army's arrival. For 63 days they fought house by house, armed with homemade grenades, stolen rifles, and sheer courage. The city became a furnace of defiance. Yet when the uprising was crushed and Warsaw reduced to rubble, the spirit of the Polish resistance burned brighter still. Even in defeat, they had proven that a nation could be conquered but never broken. Farther north, in the Netherlands, resistance came through quiet rebellion. The Dutch underground forged fake identity papers for Jews, sabotaged bridges, and smuggled food through the blockade. Families like the Ten Booms hid Jewish refugees in secret rooms, risking execution with every knock on the door. In their home, compassion became resistance, a small act of love in a world of cruelty. Corrie Ten Boom survived the camps to tell the story, but her sister Betsy did not. Yet both became symbols of a deeper truth, that courage and faith could endure even in the face of annihilation. Meanwhile, in the frozen forests of Norway, saboteurs carried out one of the most daring missions of the war, the heavy water sabotage at Vemork. Norwegian commandos, trained in Britain, skied through blizzards and mountains to destroy the German plant producing heavy water for atomic research. Their success crippled Hitler's nuclear ambitions. History might have unfolded very differently had they failed. Resistance was not confined to Europe alone. In Yugoslavia, the partisans led by Josip Broz Tito waged a relentless guerrilla war against the Axis, uniting Serbs, Croats and Bosnians under one banner of liberation. They blew up railways, ambushed convoys, and liberated entire regions. By 1945, Tito's forces had become so effective that they stood as one of the few movements in occupied Europe to free their land without direct Allied invasion. In Greece, the rugged mountains echoed with the gunfire of the ELAS partisans, while in Italy the Brigate Garibaldi struck from the shadows, assassinating fascist officials and aiding Allied troops as they advanced northward. The cost was immense, entire villages burned, hostages executed in retaliation. Yet every act of defiance, no matter how small, weakened the Axis hold and strengthened the resolve of occupied peoples. Beyond Europe, resistance took on other forms. In Burma, Karen and Kachin fighters aided British and American forces, guiding them through jungles and sabotaging Japanese positions. In the Philippines, guerrilla bands formed under local leaders, continuing the fight long after formal armies had fallen. Some operated for years in the mountains, living on faith and freedom alone. What united these countless resistance movements was not ideology, but humanity. They were bound by the belief that tyranny could not outlast the will of the people. They worked in whispers, fought in shadows, and died in silence. Many never saw the end of the war. Their names vanished into the ashes of history. Yet their legacy endured in every liberated city, every flag raised, and every tear shed for freedom regained. There were moments of betrayal and heartbreak, networks infiltrated, comrades tortured, entire families executed as examples. Still, for every captured fighter, another would rise. In occupied Denmark, when Jewish citizens were marked for deportation, fishermen carried them across the sea to Sweden under cover of night. In Czechoslovakia, resistance members carried out Operation Anthropoid, assassinating Reinhard Heydrich, one of the architects of the Holocaust. The reprisals were brutal. Villages like Lidis were wiped off the map, yet the act echoed across Europe as proof that even the mightiest tyrant could bleed. When liberation finally came, and the swastika fell from city halls and fortresses, the resistance emerged from the shadows, gaunt, scarred, but victorious. Their victory was not measured in territory, but in spirit. They had fought not only the occupier, but despair itself. And when the world celebrated VE Day, the cheers of free nations were built upon their silent sacrifices. Today, their names rest on memorials etched in stone, yet many remain unknown, buried beneath the ruins they helped to rebuild. Their stories remind us that freedom is never given. It is taken, guarded, and earned through blood and conviction. The resistance fighters were the heartbeat of hope in Europe's darkest night. They lit fires in the cold, carried truth through fear, and proved that courage can thrive even when surrounded by evil. History remembers generals and empires, but it is these forgotten rebels, the printers, the couriers, the saboteurs, the mothers hiding fugitives in basements, who taught the world the purest form of heroism, the will to resist when resistance seems impossible. When the last shots of the Second World War faded, and the smoke lifted from a broken world, the victors marched beneath banners of triumph. Cities were liberated, borders redrawn, and nations rebuilt. But in the quiet corners of history, where no parades reached and no fanfare sounded, another kind of legacy endured, the legacy of the forgotten, the silent, the unseen. They were the unknown heroes, whose names never graced the pages of textbooks, yet whose courage became the invisible scaffolding of freedom. The war had ended, but the memories of those who fought in the shadows did not fade. In the ruins of Warsaw, in the forests of Norway, in the cellars of Paris, and in the jungles of Burma, echoes of defiance lingered like ghosts. The codebreakers returned to ordinary lives, never speaking of the secrets that had turned the tide of war. The spies who deceived empires slipped back into anonymity, their true identities locked away by governments that owed them everything. The resistance fighters laid down their weapons and picked up plows, pens, and prayers, rebuilding the world they had once destroyed to save. History, however, has a way of forgetting those who fought without witness. The great narratives often glorify generals and presidents, overlooking the nameless soldier who defied orders to save a stranger, or the village girl who carried a message across enemy lines knowing one mistake meant death. Yet these small acts, these quiet rebellions, shaped history as surely as any great battle. In time, The truth began to surface. The archives opened. The secrets whispered in dimly lit rooms found daylight. Alan Turing, once condemned for who he was rather than honoured for what he had done, was finally recognised as one of humanity's greatest minds. His machines, born from war, became the ancestors of modern computers, the very tools that now connect the world he helped preserve. The Navajo code talkers, once silenced by policy, were honoured by the US government decades later, their ancient language celebrated as an unbreakable symbol of unity. Noor Inayat Khan, the British spy who died for liberty, was awarded the George Cross posthumously, her voice finally heard through the silence she carried to her grave. And yet, recognition is not what defines a hero. True heroism lives in the choices made when no one is watching, when courage is not rewarded and sacrifice is not seen. The men and women of the hidden war understood this. Their purpose was not glory, but survival of something far greater than themselves, the survival of humanity's conscience. The post-war years brought peace, but also questions. How does one measure the worth of unseen courage? How does a civilization repay the debt to those whose only monument is memory? The answer lies not in medals or statues, but in remembrance itself. Every act of freedom, every moment of justice, every breath taken in liberty is part of their legacy. In Europe's rebuilt cities, museums now stand where prisons once held resistance fighters. In Japan, Germany and beyond, memorials honour both the victims and the resistors, ensuring that the lessons of war do not fade with time. Yet, as generations pass, the danger of forgetting grows. The black and white photographs gather dust. The names blur into numbers. The echo of their sacrifice fades beneath the noise of modern life. But history is patient. It waits for those who listen. Every time we ask who they were, every time we tell their stories anew, they live again. The shadow engineers, the silent healers, the codebreakers and spies, the resistance fighters, they are not gone. They are woven into the very fabric of the world they saved. They taught us that war is not only fought with guns and bombs, but with ideas, compassion, and the refusal to surrender one's soul. They proved that humanity's greatest strength is not its power to destroy, but its power to endure. As the 20th century faded into history, new generations inherited a quieter battlefield, the struggle against ignorance, injustice, and indifference. The courage of the unknown heroes lives in the doctors who heal without recognition, in the scientists who dedicate their lives to discovery, in the activists who fight for truth despite the cost. The war they began, the eternal war for human dignity, still continues in every heart that dares to resist oppression. And so, as the final images of the film fade, the ruined cities, the secret maps, the faces lost in time, one truth remains. Victory was never owned by armies alone. It was built by countless invisible hands that reached out through darkness to keep hope alive. Their voices may have been silenced, but their echoes endure in every free breath we take. In the end, the story of World War II is not just a chronicle of destruction, but of resurrection. Out of humanity's darkest night rose a dawn born from ordinary people who chose to do the extraordinary. They stood in the way of tyranny, not because they sought history's praise, but because conscience demanded it. Their legacy is not one of glory, but of grace, a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, the light of courage never dies. And as we look back across the passing decades, we see their faces not as ghosts of the past, but as guardians of our present. They were the forgotten, the nameless, the unseen, and yet without them, the world as we know it would not exist.